three sections are going to be about establishing a firm foundation for your funding application, being clear about what you want to achieve, and then getting your application right. And as I said earlier, really the things that you need to think about and do before you even start filling in the application for funding that you want to apply for. Next slide, please. Oh, is the one before that?
Yeah, it's obviously a bit sensitive today.
So just to introduce Rick and myself, so we've put a little bit of an introduction to ourselves up there. We realised when we were comparing notes that we've both been around quite a long time, but hopefully that means we've got quite a lot of experience of putting together funding applications and having both positive successes and perhaps not always successful, sometimes not the result we hoped for. But hopefully we'll be able to give you our thoughts and our experiences, answer at least some of the questions you have, and if we don't know the answers to your questions, we generally know where to find them. So we're just going to do a couple of short polls really to start us off, and we just wanted to find out a little bit about you as a group. So Tasha's going to put up two polls, and we're just going to ask you to click on the answer that most closely reflects where you are. So the first poll is really just to find out a bit about your experience of applying for funding. Tasha,
could you stop sharing and then I can do the poll?
Yes, so the first question is, how would you rate your knowledge of applying for funding on a scale of 1 to 5?
3.
3, thank you, Melvin.
One being the highest or the lowest?
Lowest.
Okay, so quite a range. I think probably quite a few of every number except 5.
Well, that's good.
So hopefully we'll still have something.
Well, I was hoping there'd be at least 1 5 so that they could volunteer to carry on for the rest of the session.
Okay, thank you everybody. So yeah, quite a range from everybody.
You'll have to put the second question back in, I think.
Yeah, I'm just going to put it in chat.
So the poll was going to invite you to kind of choose which of the topics that we're going to cover today that you'd most like to know about. But I guess please put in the chat the things that you hope most that we're going to be covering in the session today, so that we can try and make sure we pick up on those. So we've got all of the above, which is planning a project, identifying possible sources of funds, describing what we're going to do, describing what we're going to achieve, impact, outcomes and outputs, and writing funding applications. So somebody has said all of the above, impact and outcomes, sourcing funds, describing outcomes again. Another person saying they like all of the above. Somebody else on sources of funding. Quite a few on all of the above. Sourcing funds and outcomes and outputs. Impact and outcomes. Sourcing and all. Particular requests.
I'll say that for us it's all of the above, although we've just got this national lottery grant, which is probably how you have, if you've heard of UK cervical cancer, that's probably a grant which I did about 5 months ago. But all of the above.
Oh, great, thanks Melvin. And a very specific a group that is looking for funding for a particular piece of work they're looking to do. So hopefully the information we provide today will help you to think about how you might put together an application and where you might look for great. So thank you very much, everybody. I think that's given us a good sense of kind of what you're interested in and what we hope that we will cover with you. There will be time all the way through the next section, which is Rick and myself kind of talking through some of the areas that we've identified. So do please feel free to ask questions. Either you can place them in the chat, or as I say, you can put your hand up and we can come to you. I think, Rick, you're happy to take questions as we go along, but there's also a slot at the end of each section for you to ask any questions. Just also to say that Rick and I are happy to stay on after the session finishes at 11:30 to also go on talking through things and answering any questions. So if you'd rather kind of wait and ask your question, then you're very welcome to do that as well.
Just to say 11:30 has gone.
Oh, sorry, I think I'm still in the morning session, Jean.
It's 3.
3:30. Yes, so I think, Rick,
Okay, I shall
move on to you, make a start.
Yeah, I shall carry on from where I'm here. Right, let's see if I can get this up and running. I presume you can all see that okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Good. This is where I start all my applications from, and in fact, it's when I do this training, people are a little bit surprised that we don't talk about writing applications to start with. It's really important that when you're putting applications together, even whether they're very small or very big, that these 3 things are in place, that the governance is right, the planning that is needed has been done, and probably most importantly of all, that the need has been demonstrated. And I just want to, if I can get my slides to move, come on slides. There we go. I just want to cover what I mean when I say need. And it's about identifying what the problem or issue you want to address is. It's about what are the reasons for the need. It's equally about what evidence do you have? What research have you actually done to find out that that is the right need? Who did you ask? Why is it a priority? How will the project that you're trying to put together help to meet the need that you've identified? And being very clear about kind of what it's all going to cost. And it's important to get to grips with, when I say need, what the real need is. This is an example of something that comes up a lot when we're looking at funding. So if I was to describe the need in terms of a village hall that needed a new kitchen, I would describe it as not the hall needs a new kitchen in a bid. I would be saying that it is the only meeting place in the village, that a number of groups use the hall, that the facilities are important and they attract income. I'd be wanting to look at developing luncheon clubs to address some of that isolation and that everything else is closed. The kitchen becomes the solution. It is not the problem itself. So when you're looking at the applications that you'll put together, be very clear about what real need you are addressing. It's often one of the biggest mistakes people make is they write what they think the solution is and not how that solution is addressing the problem that they've identified. Anybody actually in the middle of trying to put together an application who wants to throw out what they're doing so we can use it as a kind of example? Anyone brave enough? No? Well, that's a shame. I thought somebody would have been. I did spot somebody in the chat.
Yeah, Rick, there is one of the.
I will, if you like.
Oh, go on. Go, Nigel.
Hi. In the middle, in a rather strange sense, your example is spot on with what I'm going to talk about, which is local church, the only public building in the village, normally closed, in need of repair, plans to turn it into a community hub. It needs repairs, it needs a kitchen, it needs water, it needs a toilet. Put in an application, or several applications, and managed to raise about £30,000 so far. Big application into the lottery fund last year for about £250,000. Didn't get through the first time, mainly I think because of the competition. but they were very complimentary and said, please resubmit. We were about to resubmit in March this year, and guess what happened? Everything's on hold. So that's where we're at.
So that's a good example where one of the big mistakes people often make is they would say our village hall or our whatever building it might be is in need of refurbishment. And I would argue that if you're putting an application to the lottery in particular and many of the larger ones, you need to be very, very clear about what is the end result of that refurbishment. And that is what your bid is about. It's not about the refurbishment at all. And to do that, I mean, it's necessary to kind of break down the problem and show very closely that you've done all the research, and the research includes things like proper consultation. One of the things the lottery has always said is that they don't like any application that you haven't gone back to the people that the need is for and asked them if that was the right way to do it. So it's really important that you look at what people want, how people want to see it achieved, evidence that you've actually asked those questions so that you can prove that the need exists, and then work backwards from that to a point where you can say that refurbishing the hall will be the one way of achieving it. And it's particularly important when there's a lot of competition, because what they will want to see is not just what you want to do, but they want to see the impact of what you want to do. And we'll talk a lot more about outputs and outcomes and impact a little bit later on, but that's the key point when you're first starting to write these applications. Yes, Jean, did you put your hand up?
Yes. Well, what we're trying to achieve is, and it's really quite difficult, is because Tina and I, we actually try to support people who've been sexually abused as children and domestic abuse. Mm-hmm. We find it really difficult to get any money because of the subjects, or maybe it's because of the way we're approaching it now, I'm beginning to think. But also, we've tried to find somewhere that we can have that's safe to meet people. But because we haven't got any money, we can't find any space. The space we did find was a church, but it's not an ideal place because of people's various abuses can actually be triggers. And it's like we go round and round in circles, really. We need to have money to actually have a place for people to come to, because they're very reluctant to come out and speak out unless they've got a safe place, if that makes any sense.
So the key thing when you're looking at applying will be not so much that you need a space to meet in, but the need is that your clients find it really difficult to open up and build that trust because they're not in the right environment to do it.
Oh, you're right.
And then go from there, and then go build forward and say, so what we need is a safe place to meet, which we can do so on a regular basis. And that means that we probably need our own premises or whatever it might be. And again, it's that thinking through what is the actual problem, because the actual problem isn't having a hall, any hall. It is what that means for the people who are coming.
Yeah, but it's just difficult. The only time that people will disclose is if I'm in a meeting and they'll come up quietly, or I'll have a doctor phone me. But then if I haven't got anywhere for them to meet, it's in a coffee shop, which is not ideal. And it's like, and we don't know where to go. We have actually asked Simon Bailey, can he help us? Because it's just really hard to, I've asked, it isn't as though I haven't asked, and we haven't tried for money, but it's just that we're probably not doing it the right way.
Yeah, so it is about identifying the need from a slightly different angle.
So what did you say? Clients find it difficult?
If you can demonstrate if you talk to your clients and you said, what is the real problem around having to talk in front of lots of people, and they told you, we know what the answers to those are. That becomes part of a consultation. So you can say, having talked to our group of clients, they have said they need somewhere to be to do this safely. Not you, they've said it. So that's the starting point for your need. And then if you could identify some of the key things that are causing or making that difficult, the cost of premises, the unavailability of locations, those are kind of things that get in the way. And then when you finally put your application in, you're not putting an application in for a space, you're putting an application in for your client's needs, and the space just happens to be the solution to that.
Right, get it.
So it's a slightly different, you're probably saying exactly the same thing, it's just a question of what order they tend to be said in.
Yeah.
And that way the emphasis is much more on you understanding your client's needs and what you need to do to make that happen. So that's the most difficult thing many people find when they first start writing bids, to get their head around that what is the real need and what is actually the solution to that.
Yeah, that thank you. It's just that we do so much with campaigning and trying to concentrate on getting money as well as doing all the other stuff. It is really difficult, and then we probably keep going along the same route rather than. So this has been really helpful, actually.
So anyone else got an example they want to bring in, or shall I move on? Okay, I'll move on. So the next bit on the triangle is governance. And again, this is an area many people do not quite get. One of the biggest reasons that applications are rejected is because the group that applied were not eligible because they didn't have the right constitution or the right legal structure. And although there are funds available for unconstituted groups, they're very, very rare, and they tend to only happen when we have like crisis. If you want to actually apply for money on a fairly regular basis, it will be absolutely vital that you can demonstrate that your group is a professional, motivated, organized group that has everything in place to manage any money that they give you. So it is important that you're structured and constituted, you have a constitution. You will need, in most cases, if you're in a building, you'll need to have proof of ownership or a lease for a long period of time. You might need to show that you have a track record of delivering over a period of time. You need to have show that you've been able to measure what skills your team have, that you have appropriate policies and procedures in place, all the insurances that you might need, and that you're operating as a legally constituted organization. And very often, we get lots of organizations come to us and say, we want to form a legal structure so that we can start to apply. And they don't actually know what kind of structure they want to be. And it's really important because the legal structure you choose will determine many things. So if you're a CIC, and lots of people come to us and say, can we be a CIC? You can't be a charity. You can't register as a charity if you're a CIC. If you want to make some money through share options, or you want to do community shares, you can only do so if you're a cooperative of some description or a BENCOM. So each structure has its own set of rules around what you're allowed to apply for and how. If you're a small group and you're just formed and you haven't got a constitution, you need to put one in place, because even if you're a small group, there will be an expectation that you will have sat around a table and decided what you're trying to do and how. And you will have some rules in place. So you couldn't do, for instance, a Norfolk Community Foundation application without a constitution. They refer to us many organizations that have applied for funding and just haven't got anything in place at all. So it's really important that you understand that what governance is needed and start to put that in place when you make your applications. And think very carefully as well, when I say about things like policies and procedures, do you have the right ones for the type of money you're asking for? Because the other thing that often comes up is, can you send us a policy showing that you have a safeguarding policy or a protection of children or whatever it might be? Make sure that you've got the right policies as well. And if you haven't, organizations like Voluntary Norfolk and can provide templates for those to help you to put those together quickly. But governance is a vital part of that triangle. Any questions on governance?
Rick, there's a question here about, would you recommend a charitable incorporated organisation as the usual corporate body these days?
It's difficult to say I'd recommend anything because it depends what you're trying to do. I would say we increasingly see applications for CIOs where groups are not sure what they want, if they want to be a charity or if they're trying to be a business. I would still say that one of the most flexible ways of delivering anything is to be a company limited by guarantee, because it gives you a huge amount of flexibility over the kind of things you can do. But that's not for everybody. And the other thing that's worth thinking about is each structure requires a slightly different framework around what kind of trustees it has and how those trustees operate. And you might come to us and say, we want to be a CIO, but we don't want to have all the hassle of having trustees who can do this or an asset lock in place. So we then have to discuss, well, what do you want? How do you want to run it? And then you find the model that fits that. So it's not quite as straightforward as CIO, CIC, company limited by guarantee, whatever it might be. It is about identifying what you're trying to do, what kind of thing you expect to be doing in the future, and not limiting those choices by choosing the wrong one. And that's a mistake a lot of people make. Does that kind of answer it? Yes, Nigel.
Just picking up on that, Rick, and in relation to the Green Care Network, which I'm involved with, we're at a very early stage in our development. We've got nothing like a constitution. We've got a coordination group that's starting to guide it and monitor progress. And we're having a discussion next week about which way do we go, precisely the sort of things that you're talking about. I suppose my question at this stage is whether, given its early days, we want to keep our organisation as simple as possible. Do we just become an unincorporated group with a constitution and maybe the minimum requirements in terms of a bank account, a chair, a secretary, a treasurer? Or would you suggest we need to go for the sort of more incorporated route sooner rather than later? In
taking into account kind of your starting point, it's much easier to go from a simple unincorporated group with a constitution and then grow in the direction you want to grow into. If you make the decision to become an incorporated organization and have a legal structure, you need to have a very clear idea of where you think your organization is likely to go, what kind of funding it's likely to apply for in the future, and what kind of a structure you're likely to want. If you start as an unincorporated organization, you have the flexibility to at least bring everybody together and kind of start to have those conversations. And what I would always say, try and start small and then work big. If you work the wrong way round, you end up being trapped in a position where you can't actually do what you want to do.
Rick, there's a couple of questions.
Very helpful, thanks.
Sorry, Nigel. People are kind of asking about where to get some more advice about what might be the right structure for their organisation. Yep.
Well, again, infrastructure organisations in Norfolk, CAN, Momentum and Voluntary Norfolk can all help with that conversation. It is part of our remit to provide support for voluntary sector organisations, social enterprise, etc. So we can provide some basic support at the beginning of your journey. There are other places and we can certainly direct you to those as well. So if you're not sure, you can always give us a call. There are a number of websites that give you additional information. If you were to contact them, if you put in a search, for instance, for CIO structures, you'll get lots of information about what each of them are. There is a society for cooperatives of all various kinds. So there's plenty of information out there, but I would suggest going to one of the infrastructure organisations for some advice first. Any other questions in the chat? Because I can't see the chat, obviously. Okay. I've moved on to the next slide, which is about planning, because it's the third kind of important element of that triangle. And if I read an application that somebody's made, and it becomes very, very clear very, very quickly if they have a plan or not. Having a plan is about, before you put your application together, is about thinking through the timeline, thinking through what you need to do to reach the end point of having delivery, and planning the time scale in between those things, making sure the resources are in place, and that all the things around the ideal that you're trying to reach are there. So for instance, to go back to my village hall refurbishment project, there's absolutely no point in repairing the kitchen if you then fail to tell anybody you've done it. So you need within your planning to think about, how do you tell everybody? What are the marketing for, what kind of marketing you're going to do? Is it going to be social media? Is it going to be about sending leaflets out door to door? Are you going to have a big day where you attract people in? It's no good waiting until it's all built and then thinking, how do we do this? You need to kind of have some ideas in place, and you need to start assigning people to think about how that might work and who's going to do that bits of work. So putting in place all the steps. Now, I don't necessarily mean that you have to put all of those places in steps using Gantt charts and very sophisticated tools. Not necessary. The number of projects I've written on the back of a fag packet, as it were, is enormous. That's my starting point. I'll just make a few notes. We then go on, before we write any bids, to actually list them in order, to put in place anything that we know we're going to have to buy, to make sure that we've got the right people doing the right bits of time in the right way. And it doesn't matter what your tools are, as long as they work for you. As long as when you all come together to decide what you're trying to do, you write all of the things down that you think you're going to need, and you put them in order so that you've got a plan. I don't care what it looks like, and the funders won't care, because all they ask is that you've got one and that you know what it looks like. And as we'll talk a little bit about in a while about outcomes and etc., the plan will help you to inform those kind of questions in any application form. Most applications that come through, regardless of how much they're asking for, will usually have a series of boxes with some set questions that allow the funder to explore whether you understand what you're trying to do. And in doing that, they will tease out whether you have a proper plan or not. So it's really important to do this piece of work first. Any questions on planning?
Yeah, just to say, planning, because we have Tina's 4 transformers unconstituted, is it? Whatever she hasn't actually decided what she wants to do yet. Mm-hmm. But we find that we need to probably have a website, which obviously is going to cost money.
Yeah.
Because we could go on Facebook, but being the topics it is can attract the wrong sort of people as such. And a website, we would be able to put stories or events or something like that on. But again, we haven't got no apparatus to do it. She hasn't got a computer that is workable. Her computer is really old. And obviously we need the expertise of somebody to actually help us or set up a website, because neither of us have any idea of how to do that. And our capabilities of doing that are zero, really.
So the value of doing some of the planning exercises around, go back to what we were saying earlier about trying to find the right space to do your work in. Yeah. One of the things that within that journey that you need to think about is how you provide that communication to all of your group outside of the space. And the website may well be one of the solutions to that. But because they are quite resource heavy to develop, it might be that you can then think about, well, we can't afford to put that in place right now. And when we make the application, it's going to look really odd if we don't have something. So we can at least put an explanation as to why we're not doing that yet. And then if you're not doing that yet, think about, well, what else could we do? Are we using social media? Could we provide a piggyback on the back of somebody else's for now? And you'll find that as you start to plan around the things that you need, it will inform other actions that you will need to take as part of developing your project and making it more valid and certainly more robust. Right. And the more answers that you can come up with, the easier your project gets, and the easier it is to explain what you're trying to do and recognize when there's a gap.
Right. again, being the subject, it is quite sensitive in a sense, and we do have to be really careful how we contact people. At least when you go and stand in a hall and you speak out and somebody comes and talks to you, it's fairly obvious that nobody would walk that walk if they hadn't got a problem and they knew that you were going to get them. But yeah, so yeah, it's because there's just quite a few barriers, and it's thinking around those barriers, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And planning is the way that you actually start to put all of that into some kind of coherent order. Yes,
Yeah.
Nigel.
Just a suggestion. I mean, going back to Jean's comment, lacking a computer, etc. I mean, I think I'm right in saying that there are fairly easy routes to getting funding for that sort of basic equipment through local authority grants of various kinds. I mean, you'd be able to comment much more than I can, Rick, I'm sure, but it seems to me that's an important next step in the process for you to actually get the technology. And okay, yeah, working on these things is not for everyone, but there is a lot of free software out there that enables you to create your own website.
Yeah. And a bit like Rick was saying, we know, like Marilyn Hawes, as somebody else who I volunteer for, we could piggyback on hers by putting some of our stories on her website. But she does actually happen to live in Milton Keynes rather than Norfolk, and obviously we don't want necessarily people from. We've got the problem we've got is in Norfolk, not necessarily in Milton Keynes. Because Milton Keynes probably do a better job in their area than we do here.
I will just say, for anybody out there who's thinking about developing some kind of web presence, regardless of the scale of your project, think very carefully about how you want your web presence to work, because the self-build websites that you can do fairly easily and quickly, like something like WordPress, can be quite limiting in what you can provide. You can provide very basic information. If what you need is actually the ability to have a secure area, that's an additional cost. If you need to be able to have alphabetized resources, again, needs a database in the background. That's another need. So think very carefully before you start going down that route, just because it's the cheap way.
Yeah.
I will just put that out there.
Yeah, I think you're right there, actually, because hopefully, I mean, we've started off where I was just campaigning for people who've disclosed, and it's historical, but we're also involved in preventative, and then there's domestic abuse. So there's so many things that and childhood sex abuse and domestic abuse are connected in a huge way. And if you have one, you end up with another. So it's going to be something that we've got to concentrate on one part of it and then actually grow it.
Yeah. Planning doesn't have to all be done in one great big lump. You can do it in bits. Anybody else want to comment on any of those three things before we move on?
Just perhaps just following on from what we've just talked about from Jean's question, is about this also looking at other ways of perhaps achieving the same end. So, for example, if you need support to develop a website, it may be that might be an opportunity for a specialist volunteer for a one-off piece of volunteering, maybe through a local company or through the university or college. So I think it's also looking kind of broadly at the issue and thinking there might be a range of solutions, or even a package of maybe trying to secure some funding plus the support of a skilled volunteer.
Actually, I was thinking that this morning after we was talking about the UEA, and I was thinking that because I've done that in the past when I've done a charity for dyslexia, and we used to get somebody who video our days, saying we could actually take it to other teachers who missed our training. So, but it's knowing what colleges do what, whether, yeah.
Okay. I shall move you across. I think Claire's going to take up the baton, as it were, here. You're muted, Claire.
Muted. Sorry, I keep doing that. Yeah, just before I go on to the next session, there's just a comment, perhaps any consultation work in communities as part of your bid would be part of the planning process.
Yeah, thinking about how to do it. Very important point.
Could I ask, with the slides, Claire and Rick, is it possible to put it onto slideshow so we get a bigger picture?
Is it not?
It's got basically a whole screen with the PowerPoint stuff on it at the moment. That's better, thank you.
Better.
I hadn't realised it wasn't displaying that way, because in others it doesn't need to be done that way.
Okay. So so it's down to me to do the next section, and obviously we've already touched on this is a part of planning and thinking about your project. You need to be thinking about kind of the aims and objectives, and quite often in a funding application you'll be asked to express what the aims and objectives of your project are, and sometimes those are terms which they can be used slightly variably. But I mean, I think really what you're trying to explain to the funder is the why, the what, and the how of your project. So broadly, the why is what is the overall, the big change maybe that you're trying to achieve as a result of your project. And it may be that in this instance, it may be that you're contributing to something that's already happening more widely. But being able to say that we are doing this because, why we are doing what we're doing, and why we want to seek funds to do that. Then the likelihood is you then have some more specific aims around your particular project. So what is it that the project you're trying to fund is seeking to achieve? Change you want to make as a result, direct result of what it is you're doing. And then your objectives are you sort of the how are you going to achieve those specific aims. So I just thought I'd use Rick's village hall kitchen to try and kind of illustrate that. So you might say that, going back to, well, what we want to do is we want to upgrade the kitchen in our village hall. So what's the aim of that? What would be the overarching change that would make for the village? And you could say, well, the aim really would be to contribute to improving the health and well-being of local people, the people who live in the area and might use the village hall. Now, this one thing on its own wouldn't make that change happen, but it's a contributor. It's part of this overall improvement that you'd like to see locally. But then your specific aims might be that as a result of doing the work on the kitchen in the village hall, older people might be less isolated because they're coming along to activities. Parents might have more contact with each other, might be able to more easily access services, or maybe young people that might be involved in activities. So these are very, what you could describe as being very direct results of making this change that you're seeking the funding to do. And so what would be the activities, the objectives that would support that? So it would support the activities might be, it will help our lunch club for older people to produce a hot meal when folks come along. It might enable us to make sure that our group for young parents is able to come along, meet more easily in the hall, because we can make sure that they can get access to facilities. Or it might be that we can run our youth club more effectively and better because of the improved facilities. So it's kind of building up your pyramid, or the chain you want to see happen from direct work that can be facilitated by the funding that you're going to secure, through the changes that could happen as a direct result of doing that, to hopefully influencing a bigger change perhaps over time. And being able to kind of just work out and describe what your aims and objectives are should then help you with the often sticky issue of trying to explain as part of a funding application what your outcomes, your impact, your outcomes and your outputs are going to be. And these should be directly driven by your aims and objectives. Have the next slide, please. So following from the previous triangle, really the impact is on your own aim. Now, impact is sometimes difficult to measure than perhaps other things like your outcomes or your outputs, because quite often it is quite a large change. It might be a long-term change, or it might be a change that is, you're a bit of the jigsaw in terms of helping make that happening. Sorry, I've just had a message that suggests that my signal's a bit wobbly. People are hearing me okay? Yeah. Hopefully it will improve. Yes, but where you can, where you're able to kind of show what you think the change you're going to contribute will be, then it would be good to put that into your application. Your outcomes follow on from your specific aims. So if, for example, specific aims that people felt more satisfied as a result of the change you want to make, people felt better able to contribute, people felt more confident. So it's being able to show from your specific aims for your project what change that will be. So the language we use for outcomes is something will be improved, or it might be reduced if it was something that you wanted to maybe reduce isolation. So it's kind of very much looking at, so rather than just saying 15 people will come along to our session, I want to say 15 people will come to our session, and as a result of coming along to that session, they will be able to improve their confidence, feel happier, with whatever. So what you won't want to do is just talk about outputs. We don't want to just be talking about we're going to run 15 sessions a week in our village because we've got a new kitchen. We do want to say that you would want to say that the numbers you were hoping to achieve. You also want to look at what it is that is going to happen as a result of that happening. Are there any questions at this stage?
I will say that outcomes, generally speaking, are one of the things that people find really difficult to do. And even the lottery got outcomes wrong at one point. Didn't seem to understand what they wanted from it. So it isn't unusual to find it difficult to write the correct outcomes and impact.
And I think the other thing is that what you do need to be able to do is measure the outcomes that you're describing. So and I think one of the kind of common mistakes that's made in putting funding bids together is committing to outcomes that you're then not able to measure. So as you're working out what outcomes that you want your project to achieve, at the same time, it's really important to think about, well, and how are we going to measure that? How are we going to be able to report back to the funder that as a result of the money they've put into the project, that you have been able to make the change? And of course, there's a whole raft of different ways that you might be able to demonstrate outcomes. It might be through asking people. You could say to people, how has this project helped you? Have you been able, through this project, seen an improvement in the areas that the project's aiming to address? It maybe you can collect information like studies or other information that would enable you to demonstrate that you've measured your outcomes. And that's one of the things that I would definitely urge is to be cautious when you kind of proposing what outcomes you might be able to achieve. Just can hear me. A lot of messages. My internet is very wobbly. Is it okay, Rick?
I can hear you more or less okay.
Okay, that's fine. I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't talking to myself. Yeah. So yes, just to think about to think about how you might measure the outcomes that you're describing as part of your application form. And as Amelia's just pointed out in the chat, there was a very useful session as part of the conference, which talked quite a lot about impacts and outcomes and outputs, and perhaps thinking about how you think about those at the start of your project rather than later on at the end, when you might be thinking, well, how are we going to demonstrate what it is we want to achieve?
Okay.
I'm just a little worried, people. Okay. Another thing that you might be asked for as part of your application is a risk assessment. And this is really to show the funders that you've considered all the issues that might affect the your ability to successfully deliver your project. You might be asked what you might do, what things might go wrong, and how you have planned ahead to kind of reduce the risk that those things might impact on you being able to deliver your project successfully. So think as part of your planning process, to think about the stages of the project, what are the different milestones or the different points on the project where you need to make sure that things are in place and have happened in the right order, and what it is you might need to do to either reduce the risk that those things might happen, or being able to take action if one of those predicted issues does actually occur. You probably won't be able to anticipate every risk, but it's good to think ahead and think about the types of things that might go wrong. So, for example, what would happen if you couldn't recruit sufficient volunteers for a particular project? What would happen if you lost a staff member? And you can go through and look at both the chances that those risks might happen, measures you can put in place, and having put those measures in place, kind of what the kind of risk or levels might mean for the success of the project. And I think this is very much part of that, demonstrating as a funder that you've thought ahead about what might come up in the life of the project, particularly if the project may run over a number of years, to ensure that you have thought ahead about what it is that might impact on that project during its life. Thanks. And finally, the word milestones. So sometimes when you're doing a funding application, you might be asked for, as part of your plan, about what the milestones would be for your project. So that would be staging posts on the way to the end point of either a project of the period funding. And often I think this is, funders want to see, again, that you have a plan, that you've thought ahead, that you've realised what might be dependent on what as you're going through the life of your project, and also how you're going to measure and potentially report on where you've got to. So again, perhaps maybe just a very simple table of, we're giving timelines of when things will happen, and then a way that you can record and kind of check off the fact that you've achieved the different stages as you've got there. And as we said here, it might, again, that might be, milestones might be activities, but they might also be results. So they might be when you've kind of reached a point where you've seen a certain number of people run a certain number of activities, or in the case of the village hall, you've built your new kitchen.
Any comments? Gone very quiet. Yes, Melvin.
Hi, I'd just like to make a comment on the point that was raised earlier on about a website, which is obviously very, very important. But the most important thing about it to question is, how are you going to get people to come and look at it? It can be the best website in the world, but it's getting the people to look at it that's the important part.
Yeah, goes back to that planning process, doesn't it? About how you will put things in place to make that happen. And you might find that if you were writing an application and one of the things that you were going to do was build a website, that within your milestones, you would include your marketing plan. And you might say, you know, we're going to be, at this point, we'll have X number of people looking at our website. And part of the risk assessment based on that might be that you don't have anybody looking at your website. And if that's the case, what would you do about that? It is about just making sure that you plan all of that together, and then you identify when it should happen. And you can start to see that there's a pattern, that you have a plan, you can develop a kind of series of outcomes and outputs from that. You have a set timeline that you can use. And if your timeline has any breaks in it, that's part of your risk assessment. So this is about describing the process that gets you to those points.
Yeah, and Jackie's also mentioned that it's important to, when looking at risk assessment, to kind of grade the risks by the likelihood that they're going to happen. So again, show that you've gone through the process of thinking about the different issues that might impact on your project, and which ones might be have the most impact on what it is you're trying to achieve. Yeah,
absolutely.
For us, maybe that would be, you know, if we had a website, we wouldn't mind advertising the website on Facebook and Twitter and things like that, because then they're coming to the website and you've got more control of it, rather than then, again, I don't know much about Facebook, to be quite honest, but I would think that probably advertising on Facebook, your website is probably okay. I'm not sure about that, but that's how I felt at that moment.
It's how all the commercial organizations manage it.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've kind of gone through the processes that you need to go through before you start writing an application. I'd like to kind of take us into that writing an application bit. And I'd like to start by actually thinking about what kind of funding you need and what kind of funding you can apply for. Because actually we talk about grants because, you know, that's what most people are looking for. But there are so many different ways of pulling money in. There are grants and trusts, and there's a fundamental difference between the way they operate. There are bursaries, there are loans, there are donations, you can do fundraising events and get sponsorship, and there's crowdfunding. So there's a whole range of other options available. And part of the process is about thinking about which of these suits you best and whether you can access a range of them, because the more you can access a range, the more secure your funding is likely to be. So just bear in mind that there are lots of other ways, and we often get people say, oh, I just don't know how we're going to be able to afford. Going back to our kitchen, well, we've built the kitchen and we can't really afford to put a cooker in. Well, we know of village halls that phoned up B&Q, and B&Q have said, oh, we like what you're doing, we'll give you a cooker. So it can happen. And finding the right funding can be a real challenge. There are roughly 8,500 funders in the UK of different types, of which about 4,000 of them are grant funders. So you've got a lot to choose from. And that's just in the UK. There are quite a lot just in Norfolk, to be fair. And if you're looking for a fairly small pot of money to start with, or you're looking for funds for something quite local, look at local funders. So Norfolk Community Foundation run a range of funding and can offer pots of money from £500 up to £50,000, depending on what kind of activity you need to do. Parish and district councils and county councils all have funding available for different things. Don't forget about your Rotary, your Lions, those kind of local charities, pause charities, local businesses. A lot of businesses run their own pots of money. So almost all of the supermarkets have a fund. Even White Stuff has a community fund, believe it or not. It tends to be more national, international, but even White Stuff has one. So there is that option. There are the larger funders like the Lottery and the Heritage. And the thing with those is to try and keep an eye out for what particular funds they're offering at any given time. And then there are online fund finders, such as Funding Central, NCC do a version of Grant Finder that you can access. And if you're kind of just looking generally for funding, the Working Together, which is CAN, VN and Momentum working together, produce a funding newsletter. And you can join the funding newsletter and get that on a fairly regular basis. And what we do is we pull together all of the intelligence about what funds are being offered and put them in a single place so that you can see what's coming. I will say that one of the issues that we have, and we've had this with many funders over the years, is that many of them will produce a pot of money and they'll send it out with a really short deadline. You'll find that you might only have a month from the time you hear about it to the time you have to have your application in. And if you're a fairly small group and you're all busy, that is a real challenge and the time will go fast, I promise you. So finding these pots of money as early as possible is a real benefit. So look for as many ways to access this information as you can possibly find. When you actually get to writing your bid, I'm going to concentrate on grants and trust applications because that's the point where you generally have to do the most writing. The real difference between a grant and a trust application, and by a trust application I mean someone like John Jarrold or some of the banks, normally they ask for a free form, kind of like an A4, tell us on a page of A4 or 2 pages of A4 what you're trying to do. A grant will be much more structured and generally will have an application form. I have to say, a grant is much easier to complete. It sounds like it ought to be really easy to fill in an A4 sheet of paper and say what you're trying to do, but actually editing that down to just the important stuff is really, really difficult. So I'm going to concentrate initially on grants because that's where most people will get their funding from. And there are some very, very good bits of advice I would give people who are about to complete an application form of any kind. And I use exactly the same, and I've written hundreds and hundreds of applications. Starting point, always read the guidance. This isn't like putting a flat pack together where men say, well, I don't need that. With the guidance around funding, you do, because it will tell you what they're looking for. It will tell you how much they're prepared to spend. It will tell you what they're not looking for, which is really important, because if you're trying to deliver something and it doesn't quite fit, you need to think about how you explain why you should still be able to apply. Then I'd read the guidance again, because you will have missed something. And one of the things that most people miss is the language that's being used to describe what that charity or that funder does. Because if you can make your application use the right words and the right kind of sounding phrases, it makes the reader feel much more comfortable that you know what you're trying to do. When you start to fill your application form in, do not leave unanswered questions. One of the things that I see a lot is where, particularly with a small application, or where you've got a very limited idea of what you're trying to do, or where you're trying to do something very specific, you'll often find an application asks a question that doesn't seem to apply to you. Do not leave it blank and don't just write NA. If it doesn't apply to you, say, this does not really apply to us because, and explain why. Try to be as succinct as you can, because many of the application forms that you will fill in will have a word count or a line count. If you have a word count, you have to be very careful when you fill those forms in, because two things can happen, because it depends on how they do them. Some of them allow you to put more words than the word count allows. So if it's a 400 word count and you put 450 words, it'll show you in the box your 450 words. But when that's printed at the other end for the funder, the last 50 words are just left off. So you haven't been able to express your proper application. What I suggest to people who come across things with a word count is to actually write the answer in Word and look at the word count and then paste it back into the application. That way you've got a rough idea of where you are and whether you've got the right number of words. Be honest and try to be as clear as you can, because a funder will spot a mile off when somebody's trying to bend an application to fit their particular project. I would get somebody to read it through when you're finished writing it, usually a friend or your wife or your husband or somebody, just to read it, somebody who doesn't necessarily know what you're asking for, and ask them, what am I asking for? Can you tell me from reading that? That will tell you if you've managed to get the language right and make it succinct. Avoid writing by committee. One of the things that's really difficult is when you read an application and you get one box that's reads really well, then the next box waffles like mad, then the next box is full of spelling mistakes, where everybody's had a go at writing an answer. Try not to do that. Get one person to write the whole thing, or at least sit in the same room while you're doing it. If it's a big application, and some applications, even when you're asking for small amounts of money, are much bigger than they need to be, try to break it into smaller chunks. Don't sit down and think, I've got to write this all in one go. If they're online, you can usually save them. If they're written, you can usually just add to that whenever you need to. But try to break it down into smaller chunks so it doesn't feel completely overwhelming. Because what will happen is by the time you get to the end, you'll either start copying what you've already said many times, or you will just try to write it as quickly as possible. Don't guess. If they ask a question about numbers or they want to know something specific, go and research the answer. So don't say, for instance, in Norfolk there are about 500 people doing something, or there are 3,000 people who are living in my neighborhood who are lonely and isolated. Find out how many there actually are, because I guarantee you the funder might know. If they're local, they probably already do. Check deadlines and check them twice. With many of these applications, the deadline will have some kind of attachment to it that'll say, this must arrive by 12 o'clock on Friday the 31st, and all attachments must be attached at that time. I've seen applications go in where the attachments were too big, so they didn't. And then when you ring up at 10 past the deadline to say, oh, I just realized, they've said, oh, tough. They can be quite strict, because if you're going to get 30,000 applications, then you need a way of whittling those 30,000 down to something you can manage. And being strict with deadlines is one way of doing that. Read what it says about megabyte sizes. Very often it will say, if you're sending us information, please do not send more than 10 megabytes. Now, the first time I ever sent our Memonarts into a thing, I realized it was a PDF and it was 22 megabytes in size, which is massive. And then I had to find out how to reduce that down to a much smaller size so that I could send it. And I had to do that. It took me 3 days. So I was really happy that I checked in advance whether what I was going to be sending was too big. So that's quite an important point. I would say that the thing that funders are looking for having sat on many funding panels, I still sit on about half a dozen. What you're looking for is evidence or proof that you are an organization that can manage money, that you've got a governance in place, your accounts are sorted, you have the policies, you have some experience, and you can demonstrate that you can manage their money. Because the last thing they want to do is give people money who are then going to lose it all. They want to know that what you're trying to do fits with what they want to do. Most of these companies or funders that give money to small organizations they're not just doing it because of pure philanthropy. They have an objective as well, and they want to see what they're trying to do happen. So you have to make sure that what you're trying to do fits with that. And the only way to do that is often go back to the website and see whether they tell you about projects they've delivered to in the past. If you go onto Comic Relief, for instance, you will see a whole range of projects that they've funded. And there are certain similarities. Same with Prince's Countryside Trust. They may well put an application that says we want to help businesses, but I guarantee you if you're not an agricultural business, you're very unlikely to get that money. Because you'll see when you read through all the things that they give the money to, they're nearly all in farming communities. Make sure that your sums add up. When you're doing your accounts and your budget and you're trying to work out whether you've got the right money, make sure they add up, because actually you will be surprised how many people on a funding panel will add up every single number to make sure that they're right. If you're doing a consultation, if you're trying to provide evidence and you're writing in that you've done a consultation, make sure it's up to date. The lottery does not accept consultations that are more than, I think it's a year old. If they are older than that, you have to do them again. Often you'll be asked to provide evidence of a bank statement, and they have to be within the last 2 months. So make sure that you're up to date. Don't think, well, we did a consultation 3 or 4 years ago, and that kind of said what we want to do. You might want to put that in as background information, but do another one because it won't be up to date enough. When you write your plan, make sure that you can actually deliver your plan to the best of your knowledge. Don't be overly ambitious. Don't try to write more than you can do because you think it sounds good to the funder. Because if they hold you to it and you can't do it, that you may be in a situation where you're having to give money back. It's much better to underestimate what you think you can achieve and then achieve more, because that looks good, than it is to say we will reach 5,000 people and then only reach 2,000. So that's another important point. What's the time? 3:15. These are real tips. These are things that we spoke to the lottery. I spoke to East Coast Community Fund. I spoke to Norfolk Community Foundation. These are real tips that funders have said get in the way of people achieving an application and getting it through. Number one, and these are slightly in order. Number one is eligibility. It's the single biggest reason that people get rejected. They are not actually eligible to apply. Not showing how different you are. If you think about a fund that comes along and says, here's £10,000 for anyone who can run an art project that will help long-term unemployed or the NEET or whatever, you're not going to be the only person making an application. There will be hundreds and hundreds. And the worst thing is to read through hundreds and hundreds, and every single one of them wants to do exactly the same thing. So try to identify the thing that makes you different, the thing that helps you stand out from the crowd, and be clear about what it is you're trying to do. One of the things that I have noticed when I've done application forms is just the sheer number of times you've read the application through and then everyone on the panel says, so what are they trying to do? I don't know. I can't understand what they're trying to get to, because they've spent so much time writing all the information about proof and need and numbers, they've forgotten to tell you what they expect to do to achieve something. Don't bend it. I mentioned that earlier. Don't bend it to fit the funding. If you're not sure, it is okay to actually talk to the funder. They expect you to ring them up and talk to them. I mean, the lottery has a local people, Joe Crabb and Lucinda Leonard, who you can speak to about any applications that you're going to make. Most of them have a phone number. You can ring them up and just double check. If you're thinking of putting a bid in and you're not sure if it fits, ring them up and ask. It will be useful. Make sure you explain what you want the money for. Again, it's a bit like explaining what you're trying to do. The number of times people have put in a budget that bears absolutely no resemblance to what they've put in this text. If you're saying you need £33,000 and 25,000 of that is for staffing, say in the text that you need to pay for staffing. Read the guidelines. Again, I mentioned that one earlier. Answer all the questions and answer the right questions. Don't give a different answer to the one they've asked you. If there are conditions, make sure you meet them. That thing about sending in applications without checking how many megabytes of space you're allowed, or whether they have to have a hard copy. We've been caught out. I once had to drive to Cambridge because we had an application and we sent the application by email. And then I noticed on the application form, it said we must receive a hard copy with an ink signature by 12 o'clock on the day. And it was 9 o'clock in the morning when we spotted that. And I then had to get in the car and drive to where we needed the application to go and hand it over, because I hadn't spotted that. So make sure you've read through what all those conditions are. And the one thing I would say that is the most common mistake of all is allow yourself enough time. If you've got, even if you've got a month, there is a temptation to leave it right till the last minute before you start to actually physically write stuff. Don't do that, because it puts a lot of pressure on whoever's writing the bid, but also you'll make mistakes and you'll miss out on those crucial things that can mean you're not eligible or you don't get it in on time. So make sure you allow yourself enough time to get it written, get somebody else to read it through, pull all together all of the policies and things that you might have to send alongside it, and then check it all is there again before it goes. So I always make sure that when I'm writing these, I always put the deadline for them in my diary as 2 days before they have to have it. That's my deadline, because then I know I've got a little bit of breathing space. And just finally from me, this is a summary of what funders are looking for. Well-planned project delivered by a well-run organisation responding to a genuine need that fits the funder's criteria. Simple, really. Questions? Yes, Nigel.
Thanks. Just we are supposed to clarify whether there's any support available through CAN, Voluntary Norfolk, or other bodies on specific applications that people might want to put in. I mean, training is very helpful, and this has been a great session. I'm just wondering whether there's any sort of, you know, one-to-one support around particular applications and so on.
As a rule, CAN certainly, as a rule, CAN doesn't offer one-to-one support to put an application together, for the simple reason that obviously we're designed to empower people to think for themselves. So what if someone said to us, "Oh, I'm really struggling," we would certainly help. We would take the opportunity to talk through what kind of thing they're looking for. We would give you some hints and tips about what kind of things you need to include. We wouldn't write it. We never write bids for anybody, or very rarely. But yes, there is some advice and there is some support. And in particular, if you're trying to put an application together in partnership with somebody, because sometimes, as you know, Thriving Communities is asking for a massive partnership of groups, which can be really challenging to do. And in those instances, most of the infrastructure organisations, certainly VN and us, will help pull all those groups together. They may well help you to distribute information about the fact you're trying to pull a bid together and you need other people in it. And they will give guidelines about what kind of things to look out for and where to how to make sure that you get the right application together. And I think that's fairly true for VN as well. I'll ask Claire. I don't want to speak for Claire.
Yes, I mean, I think similarly to CAN, Nigel, we wouldn't be able to offer kind of very in-depth one-to-one support, but I think certainly, you know, being able to talk through, you know, what possible sources of funding might be suitable, maybe, you know, looking at different aspects of an application. But yeah, I think I think it's an interesting point about kind of, particularly for people who are new to funding bids, kind of where to get that support from, and whether there's any possibilities maybe for joining people up with people who might be able to offer them one-to-one support, maybe through volunteering.
I think that's a good idea, really, because I was just thinking, when you first start doing it, you haven't got a clue. And when you are sort of a small one, you're putting a lot of energy in. And if you're not actually going and getting help, you're just wasting all that energy, and then you get disillusioned and you just don't know where to go. And I just think these are, like Nigel said, they're all very good, but it is nice to have hand-holding, and I would have thought that Norfolk would have wanted voluntary groups to succeed, and to succeed at least have a first one or the first two sessions where you've actually got a little bit of hand holding and support.
Yeah, we'll provide hand holding and support, but we won't write it for you. What we'll do very often, though, is, I mean, we've done this many times with lottery applications, is if someone comes to us and says we're trying to put together an application to build a new village hall, or they're trying to put a roof on, we will often say, well, do you know that this village did it as well? And we'll put you in touch. So that they can help you. There's also a peer support network that Norfolk County Council manages, and we can sometimes find mentors who will support you as well. We can't always guarantee that because it depends who's available. Yes.
Yeah, also, oh, sorry.
Can I also just say that there are people out there who do this professionally as well. I don't know whether CAN and Voluntary Norfolk have a directory of people that provide these services. I mean, I've come across a couple recently. I know. Yeah.
There are a few. We generally don't have a list, and I generally don't recommend them either. And the reason is very simple. There are two very good reasons. The first one is when you're reading an application done by a company stands out by like a sore thumb. And what a lot of funders are looking for is that you're in your own words. They want to see the passion. They want to see it's your project and you understand it. And you lose that a little bit of that when you fund somebody else. And also you have to pay those people. And often up front, because it's very difficult to write in consultancy fees into a bid. So you often have to pay them up front, and you've got no guarantees as to whether there's any likelihood of success. For us, it has always been much more about helping you to reach a point where you are confident that you can complete an application form, that you have the knowledge you need, and that you have the understanding to pull together the knowledge gaps. That for us means that you're much more effective and much more able to grow as a voluntary sector organisation. We will try and help you as much as possible on that journey, but our role is to encourage people to develop themselves as an organisation. And so we don't generally hand out, we don't have a list of other professional fund bid writers. I know a few, and I've worked with a few over the years, and some of them have worked for us and VN. So we know of people who can do that. And if it really was a problem, we would be able to hand you over to somebody like that. And occasionally, we know that they've got good money out of some of those bids. But it would be a conversation I'd want to have first, I think.
I agree with you about joining people up, because the Men's Shed do that, and I think that works really, really well because they're spotted all around Norfolk, and I have seen how that works, and I think that's a really good system. But the trouble is with somebody like Tina and I is the nearest place is Norwich or Great Yarmouth, so we've got no one else to pull on because of the distance. And then if there's a distance, you don't know anybody, do you? I mean, if there's somebody in King's Lynn, you would actually get to know them. But because we don't live near Great Yarmouth and we don't live near Norwich, and there's this mileage distance and there's no one else around here, I've asked many a time, is there somebody else around here? And there isn't anybody.
Yeah, approaching the infrastructure organisations to help to reach out to other people is always a good idea. We will know of people who are closer. And one of the things we'll often do is say, you're trying to put together a bid. We had a guy the other day come through, was trying to write a bid for a social garden centre type thing. And he was doing it literally in a village next door to one that already existed. So we were able to explain to him that that was already there, so he might find it quite challenging. But if he needed to talk to somebody, I'm sure that we put them together and they can have a chat. We have a pretty good picture of who's out there and who's doing what, and scale. Although, admittedly, during COVID, it has been more challenging to do that because lots of organisations are doing things differently or having to do things in a different direction than they used to, and a lot of them just don't have the time to get back to us when we ask them if they're still in operation. But where we can, we will pass that information on.
Yeah, also though, we've done our research in a sense. We've gone to Health Watch Norfolk, and he's met me. The CEO has met me and said, I thought I was going to be able to prove you wrong, Jean, but I can't find anybody. So I sort of proved him right. So again, we're back to that same situation, that here we are in West Norfolk, and the nearest place that we can get any help is either Norwich or Great Yarmouth.
It's an important piece of evidence for any activity you want to do in that area, though, that you can't find support. I would suggest that you can always call CAN or VN because we're county wide. We cover the whole county.
Right. Okay. So you're a good starting point.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's the point of an infrastructure organisation.
And I think both organisations are really trying to kind of support groups networking together and kind of making connections. So that, I mean, hopefully it is a good starting point. And I suppose the other thing I would say is what we are learning more about kind of how to connect up even if we can't physically get together. And so, you know, we can connect people maybe who are in different parts of the county but could kind of catch up and kind of collaborate online. So it might be that there are opportunities that now we're starting to do things a bit differently. It might opened up new ideas as well as being you know, some challenges. So yeah, I mean, I echo what Rick said. Do get in touch with either of us to see who we know and how we can connect you up. And I think, you know, and come with ideas. That's then we can look at where we can direct you most effectively.
Because really, there's just the two of us, and it's hard to get anybody involved because of the subject. Again, we go round and round in circles between two of us, and two brains are not as good as 4 brains or 6 brains on how to go out of it. I mean, we've learned a lot from doing this this week, but yeah, it's actually finding somebody who can sit side by side. Tina is really dyslexic, and I have dyslexia in me, so we actually do struggle quite hard in a sense of with the written word as well. So. Anyway, thank you.
We both have people who are quite used to sitting with somebody and hand-holding them through the process. And it's worth contacting us just to get hold of things like the funding newsletter and other information that we distribute.
Yeah, thank you.
Anybody else have any more questions? I note that we've got about 2 minutes till past.
Melvin, did you have a question?
Can I just make 2 comments, actually?
Yeah.
First of all, to confirm with strength the point about working with the lottery, the point of consultation. That is absolutely crucial. They dwell on it all of the time. And the second point is about getting people professionals to do the work. First of all, as you've said, they're expensive. But more importantly, the time it takes them to understand the need and the problem that you're trying to fill is terrible, and half the time it never happens.
Oh, good point.
Thank you very much, Mel. Is there anything else anybody wanted to raise? Nigel?
Just a quick plug, if that's the right word. People may be aware that there's a new community lottery starting up in the Broadland area. I think it's going live in the new year. Interesting initiative. I don't know whether that's going to be repeated in other areas around the county, but basically enables people to not only buy a lottery ticket, but to make sure that at least 50% of their lottery ticket money goes to the charity or the organisation of their choice. So organisations can put themselves forward on the website and encourage people to buy tickets that will support them over the year, which I think is quite an interesting development. That's all.
Bracknell also do that.
Sorry, who else?
Bracknell District Council also have a lottery ticket thing.
So
I'll just finally say that. Sorry, I was going to say, if people are looking for small pots of money and they just have no idea where to look, get in touch, because we maintain lists of funds that are available, and we can often tell you who's running what, particularly whether it's now. The issue is that almost everything is COVID related. So if you want to do something that has nothing to do with COVID, it's much more difficult to get funding. Not impossible, but it is more difficult. And then they may navigate you through.
And we have, Rick, put together a list of mainly local smaller funders that are likely to fund smaller amounts of money, which will come out with the slides and be available on the CAN website with all the other conference papers. So do have a look at that. But as Rick says, come to either of us if you want to kind of talk through any of that in more detail. And Rick, Jean put in the chat about numbers for people at the lottery. Would you be able to provide those?
Telephone numbers?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we have come to the end of our time. So we were very happy, Rick and myself very happy, we'll stay on until if you have any more questions or want to chat anything more through. But going to maybe on behalf of Rick and myself formally close this session and say thank you very much to you all for coming, for getting all the way through the conference, and also particularly like to thank Tasha from Cannes, who's been behind the scenes keeping us all everything going smoothly during both today and the whole conference. So Rick, is there anything else you wanted to say?
No, just thank you for coming. I mean, it's always heartening to see people interested and willing to sit through an entire session. It does always make me feel quite hearty that I haven't said something completely wrong or bored you to death. But you will get feedback form as well at some point, and please be as honest as you wish.
We will be able to get recordings of the whole week, will we?
Yep. All of those are going onto YouTube.
Right, thank you.
I believe. Okay, excellent.
All right, lovely. Well, thank you all very much indeed, and very good to see you.
Thank you. Thank you
Bye.
very much, and thank you to Tasha. She's done a fantastic job for me.